Welcome, welcome, welcome. Really excited to have you all attend this panel today. My name is Steele Lorenz. I'm head of sustainable business at FBN. The panel that you're attending is called Creating Regenerative Markets, Aligning the Supply Chain. And really, this is building on a panel that I hosted back in 2019 when we were first starting to get some sustainability programs together for the first time. That was looking at what options are on the table for farmers, how can they start to participate in emerging environmental markets. At that time, we did not plan that it was going to be such a long distance between then and when we got together again. But some of the really exciting progress that I have seen in developing of these markets has gone on behind the scenes. There's been tremendous investment and development in everything from financial technology to supply chain developments and commitments, and also in policy, of course. And so some of these things I think are pretty well marketed, and there's a lot of press releases. And some of the things are happening behind the scenes. And what I wanted to do today with this program is to be able to highlight some of the things that FBN thinks is most exciting in the space, and also show how the entire supply chain is aligning and coming together. And this is not necessarily something that happens overnight, but it will definitely be something that is large enough to change the industry. And so really excited to have our four panelists here today. We are going to have them introduce themselves and their projects a little bit to get started here, and then I'll be moderating a couple of questions that I have for them, and then we'll open it up to conversation and questions that we have from the audience. So really looking forward to this discussion. So first up, on my far right, we have Allison Taylor, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer at ADM. Allison, we've been working together for a little bit now, and I would love to know more about ADM's journey to develop regenerative programs. You have a long history in engaging growers, and I think that you have had not just a long history, but also some of the most exciting ambitions that I've seen in the space. So I'd love to allow you a chance to talk about it.
Oh, thanks, Steele. It's great to be here. Yes, I think a journey is a great way to put it. Certainly ADM has been working with growers for many, many years, very, very important relationships, and talking about practices and sustainability before that became a thing, and certainly before the term regenerative agriculture sort of took hold. And for a number of reasons. We are a company that's publicly traded. We have a lot of investors asking us about sustainability and what we're doing. And it's not just about our own operations, but it's also about how we're influencing the world around us, and particularly our supply chain or value chain. And so we realized that a lot of the work we've been doing for years, talking about cover cropping and no-till and responsible use of chemicals on farms and water conservation, it could really be quantified, and we could have a more robust program around that. And pivoting from talking about practices to talking more about outcomes and desired outcomes, like water conservation, like enhancement of biodiversity. And trying to measure all of that is still a work in progress, I would say, but we've put goals around our work in this area as well, and that's new for us. So where we are now with Regeneration's program is very exciting. It's now come to the attention, I think, of a lot of our customer base, the CPGs, as we say, but other customers as well, that changing practices and putting more emphasis on environmental criteria as we talk about food and as we talk about where food comes from, it is important. Consumers are asking questions about where their food comes from, and they want to know the impact on the environment or on the planet as well. So it's now a program that we have serious goals around. So we have something called a Scope 3 goal, and that means how are we going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in our supply chain, not just in our own operations. And a lot of our Scope 3 goal, which is 25% reduction by 2035, based off of a 2019 baseline. A lot of that Scope 3 goal is about how we're going to influence our supply chain, particularly upstream and growers, and how we're going to lower our carbon footprint together. So that's a very outcome-oriented focus, and the focus of the Regenerations program, along with biodiversity enhancement and other aspects of the program as well. So now we're looking at from about 750,000 acres this year, a very North American-focused program, to 1 million acres in very short order, and looking more globally as we're growing this program as well. And we're seeing more and more customers coming in and asking us to be partners. It's a very exciting time.
Fantastic. And Allison, if you don't mind, would love to, you said something really important about Scope 3, and I just want to do a check for our audience on Scope 1 versus Scope 3. Can I put you on the spot to just give a brief description of the difference there?
Yeah. So when you think about Scope 1 emissions, these are greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the emissions that are in your control. So this is basically how you may be generating energy for yourselves, which ADM does. And so those are our Scope 1 emissions associated with the generation of energy in our facilities, or something under our control like our transportation fleet. That is, if we own it. So that's what Scope 1 is. Scope 2, by the way, is how we account for the emissions associated with energy that we purchase, so purchase off the grid, the energy bills that we get. And Scope 3 is all the stuff out of our control. So what's downstream processing that our customers are doing of our product, that's our Scope 3. The emissions associated with farming and transporting materials to our facilities, that's called our Scope 3. Quantifying that is a real challenge, and then figuring out the right goals for reducing that is too. And that's why programs around regenerative agriculture are so important to us.
Fantastic, thank you. So David Hayes, I think that back when we held this panel in 2019, very important that growers are aware of NRCS programming, EQIP, and the opportunity for cover crop, cost share and technical support. But we have gone, I think, double, triple, quadruple down on the opportunities for the USDA to be involved. And I think the time in the Biden administration was the first time that I started hearing about any administration talking about growers being climate advocates and being able to not only participate in markets, but really lead the way. Would love to hear about your background in the work that has gone on, and particularly talking about the Climate Smart Commodities program
Sure.
that the administration launched. And then also if you could touch on the Inflation Reduction Act, that would be great to hear.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's a really exciting time, actually, right now, climate smart agriculture, and many of you heard Secretary Vilsack talk about that this morning. And President Biden actually campaigned on this with Tom Vilsack in Iowa, and his theory is that, and it's a reality, that all of you are stewards of the land. And I come at personally this sideways because I had a couple of tours of duty in the Interior Department where the Interior Department is, like you, a steward of your lands. The Interior Department is a steward of America's lands. And I love the fact that there are co-benefits from being good stewards of lands. And one of the co-benefits can be helping combat climate change. Because if you protect and foster natural growth on lands and maintain wetlands, and all of these natural systems breathe in, take in, and sequester carbon dioxide. And the problem with climate change is, of course, we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and also other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrogen. And if we can have our landscapes take more of this in, store it, keep the carbon in the ground, reduce the emissions, excess emissions of methane and nitrogen, that's how we combat climate change. So that's what climate smart agriculture is all about. It's about, let's give credit to farmers who are helping to keep the carbon in the ground, helping through agroforestry and other things and more cover crops to get more biomass to bring in more carbon dioxide and increase the balance, and then also reduce the methane and the nitrous oxide emissions. So two really important points that have emerged from this new initiative and are now backed by serious money that are very exciting, I think, to the agricultural community. The first I'll mention is actually the Inflation Reduction Act, because it's based on current conservation programs that USDA has with many of you. The Conservation Reserve Program, the EQIP program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. These are programs that already are providing funding for farmers to do conservation, and the IRA passed in August has almost $20 billion, by far the most one-time investment in this program ever. But it's got a little tail to it, TAIL, which is this time the Department of Agriculture wants to confirm that spending this money on these conservation practices helps combat climate change. So they're going to be looking for confirmation that carbon is being sequestered and emissions are coming down. And actually just 2 weeks ago, the Federal Register had a request for input from everybody on how they should go about doing this, which gets to a point I hope we'll talk about, which is the need for more data. So that's one data point. The other is what Tom Vilsack mentioned, is the commodities program. This is the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. This is a separate pot of money, $3.5 billion, that $3.1 billion of which has just been awarded to 70 major projects, as the Secretary talked about this morning, in all 50 states. It's an experimental pilot project given to lots of partnerships. Many of you are involved or will be one way or another. And it's going to test this important proposition that rather than continuing to push out subsidies like through conservation, those conservation programs are going to continue, but to really provide farmers with monetization of their climate smart practices, let's see if we can't get a higher margin at the grocery store, at the end use of this commodity, because like an organic produced product, a climate smart product will command a higher price because people care about climate. And this program is designed to test out that proposition. And in order to do that also, we're going to have a better sense of the measurement of really what the benefit is. And so measurement and then figuring out a system potentially to stamp a product as climate smart and get a higher margin, which would be a more direct and exciting way, I think, to get compensated for this, rather than relying on voluntary carbon markets, which are not as grounded and perhaps not as sustainable.
Yeah, so, David, you touched on a couple of things. The need for more data we're going to come back to after I let some of the other speakers speak, but I think you'll find a resounding amount of agreement there. I'm curious to know, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but and how these policies were developed. There was a lot of care that was put into not having this confused as a regulation. That this is opt-in, this is voluntary, and it's designed to be an incentive. Can you talk a little bit about that process and about how this has been designed to be farmer friendly?
Yes, from the outset, this is all about incentive-based activities that will be good for the farmers and good for the customers and good for the climate. Yeah. So I worked, so the President Biden established a climate policy office in the White House and a national climate advisor, and I until very recently was a senior member of that group and worked with the Ag Department to develop the concept of climate smart ag and forestry and make it a reality. And that's an ongoing process, but with the launch of the commodities program, and now with Congress coming in with both feet saying $20 billion toward this effort to reaffirm these concepts, including $300 million. I'm sorry, is it 300? I think it's $300 million for testing, for monitoring. So Congress is not an expectation that farmers are going to have to figure this out here. You know, this is the government trying to come in and help get the science right, so it's big.
Yeah, absolutely. And
all about incentives.
And I think validate a lot of practices that farmers have seen be successful in a variety of different components of farming as well, right? So cover crops and tillage, what can we actually, how can we help them get credit for that in a voluntary certification?
Correct.
Fantastic. The Maggie Monast with Environmental Defense Fund. So it's not often that outside groups come to us and say we have research about farmers about new products that FBN should be launching, and that surprises us and they end up being right. But that's exactly how Maggie and I met. Maggie, I think you have a really interesting role at EDF where you are focused on the intersection between finance and agriculture. Can you tell us a little bit about that and about the vision of EDF and your work in the space?
Yeah, thank you, Steele, and hi, everyone. So yes, Maggie Monast, I'm from Environmental Defense Fund, or EDF, which is an environmental advocacy organization that globally works to build really strong science and economics into solutions to environmental challenges that work for people. And we also do a lot of collaboration with businesses around the world. And I was just at the last panel, which was fantastic, hearing from farmers about the different conservation practices or climate smart practices that they're considering implementing or testing, trying out. And many of you may be doing the same, thinking about, do I want to do cover crops, in what way, thinking about your tillage, thinking about your nutrients. And we've seen that those practices can provide real value to you and your farm. But often that goes unquantified, unrecognized, and unrewarded. And I really, my aha moment for that was when I was speaking with some of our farmer advisors, and they said that they wanted to better understand the impacts of their own conservation practices on their budgets. And I was kind of like, because these are they're very savvy farmers, excellent business people, committed conservationists. And if they weren't really seeing how their practices filtered through and affected their budgets and ultimately their bottom lines, that told me there was a much bigger problem there. So we dug in with some ag economists and accountants to really start doing that quantification work. And now we're bringing that to scale with land grants and other data sources. And soon after, we found that not only were farmers really interested in that data, but their financial providers were really interested in that data too. And they also wanted to understand the relationship between farmers' practices and their risk and their creditworthiness and other factors that matter to them. So from that, we built this whole body of work with agricultural financial institutions who honestly are kind of late to the party on sustainability. They were sitting on the sidelines, were not thinking that this was something that affected them. And really that has changed over the last 5 or so years, where now agricultural lenders are seeing that they and their farmer clients face risks from changing weather and climate change, but there are also a lot of opportunities to improve practices and to tap into new sources of revenue or lower costs or improve yields. So Steele and I met after we did some market research trying to understand if farmers were offered a new loan product that integrated some incentives for climate smart practices, would they even want it? You want to know that demand is out there if you're going to try to advance something new. And so we tested it with a market research firm with a representative sample of Iowa farmers, and we found that about half were interested in participating. And so that showed us that there was this untapped potential out there to start bringing together farmers' environmental performance and their financial performance through their financing. And so that led to the launch of the Regenerative Ag Financing Program. And it was really exciting to see FBN being first to the market in that and trying something. And I think we'll talk more about data, but your ability to bring that data and connect it with your financing was really the key there. And that pilot filled up, and y'all are expanding now, and that's just really exciting to see. And so, as we look ahead, we're going to see more agricultural lenders coming into this conversation. Many of them are already in the conversation, but they don't yet really know what to do. So it's a really exciting space to be involved in and figure out how we can connect the dots between some of the supply chain programs, financing, and government programs as well.
Yeah, and for those of you that were in Charles's keynote today, we are, the RAF product was one of the best-selling financial products that we've ever had. We are more than doubling down with assistance from the Climate Smart Commodities Grant. We plan to scale that up to $1 billion in operating loans over the next 5 years. And so that product is a very good example of how folks on the stage and have worked together to be able to create what we think is going to be 2.0 in terms of the supply chain work. So, Maggie, I really appreciate that overview. Devin, so FBN has been working on this space in a long time, sometimes in a very loud way and sometimes in a very quiet and progressive way. I'm curious to know from your standpoint, what do we really want FBN to be for growers when we think about regenerative practices? What is the service that we're trying to provide, and how do we think about sustainability in our business?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say Steele and I have been working on this together since the beginning. He actually does all the work, but he's going to ask me the question. I'll give the response. And the role we really play, see ourselves playing, has evolved quite a bit in response to, I think, a lot of what you've heard on the stage around trying to understand what growers are looking for. And our journey started really trying to understand that, understanding how we reward farmers who have made these investments already and trying to incentivize farmers who are interested in making some investments around practice changes. Also really trying to understand how you build a market around this and what that market can be, tying that into the downstream ag value chain into scope 3 emissions and ultimately how you quantify that and again build markets around it. And so we found ourselves in a position where we are very good at data analytics in this space. We're a technology company, and we found ourselves in a position where we felt we could build some of that digital infrastructure and connect those dots a little bit more. And so that's really what we've built over the last 3 years, is this ability to work with our large member base that we have today, that amounts to about 55,000 farmers in North America, use a lot of the infrastructure we've built from a digital standpoint, collecting agronomic data very cost effectively and easily for our growers, and then using and partnering with a lot of outside academic institutions, organizations like EDF, to quantify environmental impact, however the market needs to define that. And then ultimately, carrying that through into a marketplace. And the place where we play is primarily what we call inset markets, so built into the supply chain, built into commercial aspects of how we do business, like lending today, in the way that farmers do business today. And I think fast forward, a lot of things have been said on the stage already. We're all working together here, and we're partnering with ADM on these supply chain programs. We're partnering with EDF on the Regenerative Ag Finance Program. We're using funds from the USDA to make a lot of these programs available over the next, a year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then I think the next stage here, and that we're trying to play a role, and I think everyone on the stage is trying to play a role in, is understanding how this market solidifies. Because right now we're still on the front end. I think we have a lot of the good core fundamentals. I think we know where we want to go, but the market really needs to take hold in a more meaningful way to allow for, I think, the level of scale that we're all looking for.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the key things that you all kind of talked about as we went through is data, and data can mean a lot of different things. So I'm actually going to pose a different element of a data question to each of you as we come through. And so, Allison, one of the things that we have partnered around in terms of data is verification, helping ADM know that the practices that are happening with the growers that are enrolled in their programs. How have you all thought about data as a part of aligning the supply chain and building regenerative programs?
Yeah, thank you. So I totally agree with everybody's statements that data is so important, and for so many reasons. For us, as I was saying, we are really looking at outcomes. So not just number of acres where certain practices are taking place, but what's the improvement, what's the hopefully continuous improvement that we can show in our supply chain. But there's also a commercial value to this. So think about something like carbon and scope 3, which I described as one of our obligations to show that we're reducing those scope 3 emissions in our supply chain. Well, our customers have those same goals. And so they're looking to us to provide lower carbon, lower footprint goods to them. And they're going to be reporting in their sustainability reports or to their investors and to their consumer customers, just like we are, in terms of the progress they're making in lowering that carbon footprint. So we can't just make up that data. Some of us are actually putting that in our financial disclosures now, and so that has a very high level of verification attached to it. When we publish a sustainability report, it might look kind of pretty on our website, and I hope you go check it out at adm.com. We actually verify all the numbers there. So when we are putting numbers out, and this is kind of the standard that I think most companies are really adhering to, we verify these numbers. We don't just say, you know, trust us. So these kinds of data platforms and verification programs are really key for us. I think there's also the possibility that our customers are going to be asking for these numbers. What's your supply chain carbon emissions look like? Because they're going to compare us to one of our competitors. And they're going to want to have a lower score. And so if we're being compared to others, we really need to have an even playing field. They need to have verified data, so do we. We also need to be using the same methodologies, which are a little challenging right now. It's just in order to have credibility, but also a level playing field competitively. These data platforms are essential. We're working with hundreds of thousands of growers around the world. I talked mainly about our North America program. As I said, we're fanning out. To be able to work with that many individuals, we need data management in a very big way. So these are some of the reasons that this is so key for us.
Fantastic. So David, the question that I have for you around data is that you had referenced in your remarks that you were hoping the Climate Smart program was going to advance the scientific understanding of carbon and carbon sequestration. I know that that's a part of what your next role is going to be as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the data role there?
Sure. So let me just preface it quickly by mentioning that, you know, because of the climate concern, there's been an attempt to understand basically, you know, what the emissions profile is for various sectors, and so that we can address these issues. And the land sector, through no fault of its own, if you will, has a big role to play, and globally, it's like 1/4 of all emissions. A lot of that is because of deforestation in places like South America and Indonesia to convert to ag crops, actually, which is a big problem. But in general, unlike other commercial areas, like the other greenhouse gases that are coming from the oil and gas sector or whatever, there's been an underinvestment in understanding the getting down to the detail level of what the carbon fluxes are in agriculture and forestry. There's more data on forestry, but still not enough. And again, this is the good news part of the equation. So if we can understand better how much of that excess carbon dioxide is being sequestered by good practices, that's going to redound to the benefit of everyone on the supply chain. And the consumer is going to feel good about buying these products. So what I found in my work in the White House on this was just a reconfirmation that the data are poor because there's not been a reason to have particularly good data. So you've got some good models that like Carbon Farm and Carbon Planner and 2 or 3 others, the MSU model and the University of New Hampshire model, but they're not based on a strong database. They're guesses from these practices, et cetera, and then you've got software that spins off of that, providing some tools to make decisions, but it's all on a very squishy database. Now we have government money and direction from Congress and opportunities for new markets. We have the financial wherewithal and the incentive to do better testing. And that's my next step. I'm going to Stanford after this, and was just on the phone earlier today with Bill Ritter at Colorado State, and we'll work with Cornell and UC Davis and others, and EDF, and you guys to help figure out how to get good data. And I just stopped by the Earth Optics booth downstairs. They've got amazing new technology. This is the cool thing, right? The old style of trying to do soil samples everywhere, it's expensive, it's just not practical. There are some new technologies, new approaches. So I'm hoping that we can kind of pull together the industry, the academy, farmers, the value chain to take advantage of this moment in time to understand what we're dealing with and how we can make it a big positive and an incentive for these good practices.
Yeah, fantastic. And Maggie, my data question for you. I know you've done a tremendous amount of work linking the costs of regenerative agriculture to the ROI. I'm curious to know how you think about data and the increasing amount of it in this space driving that mission home and using it to inform grower decisions.
It's a great question. And really, I think ultimately it's about connecting some of the good environmental data that David's talking about with that kind of financial data so that we can really see how they relate to each other. And similarly, as we've seen an underinvestment in agriculture on the scientific data side, there's also been an underinvestment in agriculture and especially in regenerative and climate smart practices on the economic data side.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we're doing is with some of the major farm financial databases held at the different land grants to help them integrate in cover crops into their databases. We're doing that with the University of Minnesota's FinBin database. So they'll actually be able to look and see, oh, okay, here's what it cost farmers when they were doing these cover crops. Here's how the cost changed over time. Here's how it affected their tillage and maybe their input use. And that's really going to be the key to showing farmers that this is something that's worthwhile. Like Trey said in the last panel, for something to be profitable, you have to reduce costs, increase yield, or get a new revenue stream. And so we're really trying to figure out the dynamics of all those three things and how we can make it worth it to farmers.
Yeah, fantastic. So Devin, the only thing that we talk more obsessively about at FBN than farmer ROI and margin is data security and privacy. As I think about all of the new opportunities that are going to be unlocked as we develop linkages between supply chains, between financial institutions, between policy incentives, how do we make sure that we are really protecting farmers' data, and how do we ensure that growers can securely participate in these programs?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I think one that comes up often with FBN. I think there are two components to this. The first is just the technology itself and making sure it's secure. And we spend a lot of time and resources investing in just the technology itself. So if there are attempted hacks, which there are all the time, that we can protect that information. The second piece is how we use it, and how the level of transparency we have around how it's used. And so what we generally do with the vast majority of our programs is when we collect information, we're scoring it, and then only that score, in many cases called a carbon intensity score, is then passed on to the value chain, not the full sort of data set with hundreds of thousands of geospatial data based on the practices of that individual operation. It is that single score, such that there can be I think less granularity and sort of what's flowing through that entire value chain, I think, which is really important to a lot of our producers. In cases where more information is required, that is always incredibly transparent and it's always opt-in. It is not something where this should ever be unexpected. And if you even look at some of the agreements I think we have, it's usually big, bold letters around where data goes and how it's treated. And I think that visibility, that transparency is critically important in all this.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a tremendous amount of complexity that we start to see with some of these contracts, and so being the transparency is crucial.
Yeah, maybe the other thing that I would add here is that this is, these programs, sustainability programs, I think are an example where oftentimes we see less reluctance to part with some of that information because there's a clear benefit. In some cases, there's not always a clear benefit to providing information, providing data. I think in this case there is. Either it's a premium or it's just more clarity around your individual operations. So I think this is what Steele has told me at least. So I'm going on trust here. But given just the opportunity, and I think the upside for growers is an area where it just makes more sense to at least participate.
Yeah. So again, the previous panel that we're referencing is 2019, and I'm curious to know if we play the same exercise right now, if we sit down together in 3 to 5 years, what do you, from your individual perspectives, think has changed positively, negatively, indifferently about the market, about the aligning of supply chains to bring regenerative practices to market? And I'm going to start on the other side this time, Devin. I'm going to start with you, and we'll go backwards.
Well, I think the market's changed a lot for us, and at least how we view this. And one thing we haven't talked about is the differences between programs. And oftentimes, I think sustainability in ag is synonymous with carbon credits. And I think the concept that David has referenced, where you're basically absorbing carbon into the soil, organic carbon into the soil, and so it's holding that carbon in the soil and removing it from the atmosphere. There's also the other side of that equation, which is abatement, so just reducing emissions generally. And those two outcomes have very different needs from a data collection standpoint and a validation standpoint. And from a carbon sequestration perspective, there are these very sophisticated models that infer sequestration based on things like soil samples, and they're good, but there's a need for a lot of data to make them a lot better because they're probably not yet good enough. On the abatement side, it's a lot more clear in terms of how you evaluate those figures and really justify those claims that are being made. And so today we spend a lot of time and attention understanding those opportunities and those markets. And so I think there's both kind of a near-term and a long-term opportunity here in ag, where for us, where we spend most of our time and attention is around kind of what's immediately in front of us and the concepts of abatement, reducing emissions, and tying that into the existing value chain. And I think long-term, there's going to be a bigger opportunity around, or at least an expanded opportunity around how else these markets can take shape over time. And not all of these areas are at the same maturity levels within the marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's really sums it up nicely. We want to paint with a broad brush and say regenerative ag is one thing, but in reality, it's a bunch of different pieces that are different maturity levels, and you see that, and sometimes it's painful, and you also see different, I think, speeds of development within there. So I think that's important to note. Maggie, for you, what do you think changes or is different in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, FBN's not going to be the only ag finance provider with a product that rewards environmental performance. Sorry, y'all are going to have some competitors in the next few years. The rest of the ag lending space is catching up and grappling with these considerations. They're at a disadvantage in that they do not have the kind of data platform that FBN has. So thinking about how they form data systems that allow them to understand the granularity that we're talking about is going to be a big leap for them. But we just completed the first global survey of agricultural financial institutions along with Deloitte, and we found that 87% of ag lenders think that climate change is going to present a severe material risk to their businesses, which means their clients. But only 25% are right now incorporating that into their decision making. So obviously there's a big gap between the perception of the challenges that lie ahead and the action, and I expect to see that gap close significantly over the next few years.
So Maggie's prediction for the next 5 years. 5 years from today, our competitors are going to be where FBN is today. Just note that down.
We welcome the competition.
David, to you, what do you think we're going to see?
So I think we'll see, first of all, a lot more interest from a lot more market participants in greenhouse gas and carbon accounting. I'm not talking about regulation. I'm not talking about incentives. I'm just talking about there's going to be a call for anyone who is providing consumer goods to provide information about how, the climate impacts of getting that product to market. We see a lot of that now, and you see it in leadership from ADM and others. But 5 years from now, and in part it's because this is the key to addressing climate, which is to get the emissions down and sequester as much as we can. And it's very possible now. I mean, we're moving toward a much more clean energy economy, and the opportunities in ag and forestry feed into that. So that's one piece. Second piece is I'm very excited. I think 5 years from now, 3 to 5 years from now, we'll have just much better technology and ability to combine practical, cost-effective field testing with remote sensing and be able to provide the kind of data that the ADMs are going to be asking for. And I want to just reiterate Devin's very good point that this is not just about the carbon sequestration, but very much about the nitrogen and methane emissions use cases also.
Yeah, absolutely. Allison, to you. In 3 to 5 years, what are we doing and what are we talking about? What does the future hold?
Well, we actually have to set 5-year milestones, so we've got a few numbers out there that we want to hit. And in the bigger picture, picking up on what David was saying, I think we're certainly going to see a lot more of our customers regularly asking us for data. So that they can perhaps even be developing labels for products so that they can tell the public, like calorie information, this is carbon information about this product, which means we have to give credible information to them, and we have to do it very quickly. It just has to kind of be table stakes. For that reason, I would assume we will have many more of those regenerative acres in our supply chain, and we have goals around that, and we see that interest accelerating already. We announced a substantial agreement with one of our customers for regenerative agriculture. That customer had separate regenerative agriculture goals because they want to be helping to drive these good practices. And we're going to see more. That's a very competitive landscape among CPGs. We're going to see more of those customers of ours competing with one another, setting those goals, and trying to grab those regenerative acres for their own in their supply chain. So we'll see more agreements with those kinds of customers as we're working with a lot of you. I think in the very good news was, why are we doing all this? We're going to see healthier soils, and we're going to be able to measure a lot of those attributes much more accurately than we do now. And that's the point of a lot of regenerative agriculture programs. It's not just providing these credentials ultimately to consumers, but it's really enhancing the health of soils and productivity of soils, so that the footprint of farming can be efficient, less impactful on the environment, more robust, and measurements that are beneficial to business as well as beneficial to the environment. On the data front, I think that we will be able to measure this all more accurately, so that we can maybe provide that credential very quickly, even in a verifiable way on a package. I think we will be looking at a more robust discussion around a voluntary carbon market, more robust than we have today. That's not ADM's thrust with our regenerative ag program, but I think there will be more of that activity as well. So there's going to be a lot of excitement in the next 5 years.
Yeah, fantastic. So with that, we're going to open it up to some questions. I'm going to sacrifice my mic, and if you have a question, please make yourself known. Otherwise, I'm going to say more things. Okay, that person has a question. Do you want to run it?
Hi, curious maybe about the intersection between farm profitability, the regeneration space, and then I guess the third, which would be, I had it, food security. You hear a lot about one coming at the expense of the other, and just curious about your thoughts on that triangle.
Sure. I can start this one off, and I think those three things can certainly work well together, and I think food security is a really important piece here. And food security to us means that, and I think we very much support this as a company, we can't sacrifice our ability to produce low-cost, abundant, healthy food for the planet. That always comes first. It has to come first. But investing in things like regenerative ag, climate-smart ag, doesn't need to sacrifice that. In fact, it should enhance those concepts by investing in practices that improve soil health and ultimately improve things like yield relative to inputs. And so this really starts to, if done well and done the way we think it can, actually lower costs, lower input costs, improve yields, improve profitability, and ultimately support food security long term. Now that's not a given. I think again a lot of work is going in right now, and this is where companies like ADM are putting their money where their mouth is, providing premiums to help support that testing phase and understand how we ensure that growers are rewarded for the practices they've adopted or that they will adopt in order to experiment with this and ensure that we can get to this future that we're aspiring to.
I think there's going to be a lot of recognition that farms can become much more resilient and resistant to some of the extreme weather events that we're seeing as a result of climate change with practices like cover cropping. And there's a lot of demonstration of that. But for us, that's also a food security story, because the more resilient our supply chain is, the more able we are to move food and nutrition around the world. So there's a very direct tie and a very clear food security story that we tell when we talk about one of the reasons that we're incentivizing these programs. And profitability as well. If there's greater resilience on the farm and efficiency on the farm as well, we like to see enhanced profitability. That's the benefit that's beneficial for all of us too.
Hi there, Ben from Council Bluffs. I think David and Devin both talked on sequestration of carbon and the need for different data validation there. So there's sequestration on the farm, and then there's also other forms of sequestration. 40% of that corn crop goes to ethanol. There's a big push for CO2 sequestration from the ethanol plants as well. Could you kind of talk about like the value of corn now being, it's the more environmentally friendly corn being more valuable to people like ADM or ethanol plants in the space?
Sure. Well, obviously, maybe it's not obvious to everybody, but I think it's probably obvious to everybody in this room. It is better for the climate to be burning ethanol than it is gasoline, because of the regenerative character of ethanol. Fossil fuels are one and done. So it's a good point, and we see this in forestry also, obviously, where wood products can replace carbon-intensive steel and cement in buildings, and there's a lot of excitement around tall buildings, tall wood buildings, and a recognition that essentially farming trees managing our forests in a smarter way can be net positive for climate for the same reason. The carbon in that wood in that building will be there a long time. So it gets complicated, obviously, when you look at the full life cycle associated with generating a 2x4 or a gallon of ethanol. but certainly it starts with an advantage when you're talking about essentially a renewable fuel.
Yeah, and I can tell you without a doubt that ethanol companies are very focused on this from several aspects. The first one is sourcing their grain from growers who have lower carbon intensity, and so this is generally called variable feedstock sourcing, and so there are potential compliance markets in place, California and other states around, rewards for incentives to be able to source from farms that have a lower carbon intensity that ultimately go into the fuel, which then by virtue of that would have a lower carbon intensity. So that supply chain, that sourcing element is really, really important. And we've had a lot of conversations with companies and policymakers around what rules need to be put in place to get those markets to work. And so that's kind of step one for ethanol specifically. So, step two is there's also a lot of conversations right now around capturing the point source emissions. And so the production of ethanol creates concentrated CO2 today already. Right now, sometimes it's used in commercial uses and sold. A lot of times that's just released, but it's concentrated already. And a lot of investments going in right now into how you can move that concentrated CO2 to spent oil wells or geological formations where you can actually pump that into the ground and store it permanently. And so those investments, those practice changes would turn ethanol from a fuel that is better meaningfully than fossil fuels today, that is one that could actually be carbon negative, and which is really, really important and ultimately benefit our climate, benefit growers as well.
So to bring that to life, this is what we do in part. So we are an ethanol company as well. And we are definitely a part of these discussions to bring to various policymakers' desks the actual data, speaking of data, to demonstrate that these low-carbon supply chains are out there. There's actual data to back that up and to show that these are very sustainable ways in which to source and create the feedstock for fuels. In addition to that, we have processing facilities. We already, for the past decade, have been pulling off that pure CO2 and sequestering or storing that underground in a facility in Decatur, Illinois, that happens to underlie our ethanol plant. We were just lucky to be located on top of a suitable aquifer, a geological formation that is not everywhere in the world, but it has certainly become a popular subject these days as others who are looking to produce ethanol or find other ways to pull CO2 out of their various facilities and productions to move that via pipeline perhaps into the wells in our facility or other facilities that might be built. So this is actually something that's been going on. It's been going on for 10 years in a very safe way in Decatur, Illinois. A demonstration project, in fact, that was formed with the Department of Energy and the University of Illinois and the U.S. Geological Survey. So we've been demonstrating this is possible, and we certainly think this is a part of the future.
So I'd like to understand why farmers can't be paid more of the carbon reduction credits. I understand in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's $85 a ton now for carbon reduction credits that would go to companies like ADM. I've been told by my crop consultants that if we follow regenerative practices by using cover crops and no-till like that, I can sequester a ton of carbon on my acre of ground. So why aren't the farmers, where's the disconnect? Because we're only, the best we can do right now for carbon credits for farmers is somewhere $10 or $15 an acre, which doesn't really make it worth the effort. So where's the disconnect, and how come we're not offering more to the people who are working the land to save the carbon there?
We can
go for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, two thoughts on that. I'm sure everybody here has thoughts on that. One is that, we have to think about this in terms of supply and demand. And so the price that you get paid for carbon, potentially, depends both on the prevailing price of carbon, what companies are willing to pay to, offset or reduce their own emissions, and the amount of carbon that you're able to sequester or emissions that you can reduce. And so that's why the science that David's talking about is so important, because if we've got uncertainty in that science of how much you're actually sequestering or emissions, nitrous oxide that you're reducing, that ultimately affects the credit that you could receive and the amount you could receive. So I think, in the next few years, we'll probably see that price, the price that people are willing to pay go up. But we're also going to see more precision on the scientific side, so that could potentially cut both ways in terms of the price that's ultimately offered to the farmer. Another thing, like when I look at this, I cover both our finance and markets work at EDF, so I try to look at the whole suite of incentives that are becoming increasingly available to farmers. And I think everybody up here would admit that it's a very spotty marketplace right now. And so depending on where you are and what you're doing, like you may have 5 opportunities available to you, you might have none. And hopefully, as Devin said, we're going to see those markets like really solidify in the next few years, and you'll have a better, clearer set of options that are available to you that you can weigh. But I was at a grain marketing seminar, and the speaker said, "Oh, well, what's the best price of corn?" And people looked around like, what? I mean, the highest one, right? And he was like, it's the one where you make a profit. So that incorporates your own knowledge of what it takes for you to do these practices, what it costs you, and then what you need in order to make a profit. So, many farmers, many of you in the audience are probably already implementing a lot of these practices profitably. That's awesome. You may have opportunities to access other incentives. That's icing on the cake. Others of you, it might just not work 100%, and so you need those opportunities in order to make the economics of the full picture work. So that kind of knowledge of your own economics and of those practices is really essential when you're evaluating any of these opportunities.
Yeah, so just a few things on my side. The kind of the numbers you referenced on carbon credits, those are voluntary markets. That's what the market will bear right now. It's just supply and demand. In terms of your question around some of the funds that are being made available from the USDA, those funds are going to farmers, at least in the partnerships that we're working on. We're not keeping those. So for example, with the RAFT program, I think we're getting about $4 or $5 million to fund discounts for operating loans. 100% of that's going to farmers, to those discounts. We don't keep a dime. And some of the grant that we're part of with ADM, those funds are being used to pay incentives for participation and performance in the programs that we're working on together. And so a lot of this is on the front end, so those programs are coming in right now, but those dollars are going to farmers.
Yeah. And I would just say, I think the disconnect is that is on the demand side, and because your practices are worth more than $10 a ton, but there's not enough confidence. There are 2 things missing. One is there's not enough confidence in the quantification of the benefit. This is not just for farming; it's also for forestry, and the rules are all voluntary. And so, secondly, the potential buyers are getting pressure that this voluntary carbon offset market isn't actually providing any benefit at all. And that they should be spending their money not on carbon offsets, but on their own operations and reducing their own carbon footprint. So that's why I think the future is so bright in terms of the ability of the new technologies coming in to help understand and quantify the benefits of the practices, and also looking to not a carbon market or a voluntary carbon market, but instead maybe the marketplace itself to, with a stamp of carbon smart agriculture along with the organic or whatever, get a premium in the marketplace as a direct way to compensate you well and fairly.
Yeah, I'll just add a real quick point, and that is, it is early days, and so a lot of these things will be worked out and will become a lot more certain. For companies that are reporting their emissions and wanting to lower those emissions according to their goals that say we're going to reduce by a certain date, those reductions have to be verified, and there's some accounting rules and guidances, and they're very clear that utilizing offsets or credits to meet those reductions is not allowed. And it's disfavored in some areas of scrutiny of what companies are doing. But actually, the guidance says make those operational changes first, make them to 90% of the reduction that you're looking for before you use any of those credits or offsets. So there's a reason as companies are at the beginning or middle stages of making those reductions that they're still focusing on operational changes, but that's going to change when they get to the point where they can't make any more operational changes.
We'll take that last one if it's quick.
Testing. My name is Richard. I'm an Iowa farmer. A couple of comments. I certainly see the value in terms of cover crops, but it is expensive. It costs me probably in the neighborhood of $45 to $50 an acre to put those cover crops in. If it's real dry in a drought and you have to fly it on, it may not come up. This year, when I was done combining crops in the middle of October, it was very easy to accomplish the seedbed preparation and drilling of the 75-pound cereal rye and get it established. But there were a couple of concerns. The FSA program required pre-authorization for any reimbursement. Well, there were difficulties in terms of getting that, so bottom line, no cost share in that circumstance. Now, I understand ADM has a $10 per acre program, and it can be certified after the fact, which is actually quite good, because then if you have established that cover crop and can prove it, you can actually get that reimbursement. But from a governmental bureaucratic perspective, to have had to get pre-authorization for the practice becomes difficult when Mother Nature does not cooperate. So if you have a circumstance where you're done, finishing combining by Thanksgiving, of course, it's not going to work at all. So, having contracts signed in July, August, or whatever that we're going to do that process, that we're going to do the cover crops, becomes difficult to be assured of having the ability to get that cover crop established. So concerns from a contract perspective, pre-authorization versus post, if you actually got it established, to then be, to get the reimbursement becomes, more reasonable.
We could probably answer that in quite long form. Anyone want to take a brief, and then we can chat with Richard afterwards. Talk about contracts.
Sounds like bureaucracy run amok. Very sympathetic.
Yeah, I think we're going to cut it there, and feel free to come and chat with the panel after that. But I do think that Richard's comments were really important in understanding some of the things that we talked about and some of the nascent parts of this market, even as we develop. So I want to thank our panelists for their comments today. I really appreciate the work that you all are doing and the time that you've given us. And it is my great honor to say that the bar is now open. It is happy hour, and thank you for coming, folks.